In this lecture, you will learn about Manifest Destiny, the Oregon Trail, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As Americans moved westward, they encountered fewer forests and eventually reached the Midwest, a treeless prairie where they could spend less time clearing the land and more time cultivating it. Labor-saving improvements in farm implements such as the John Deere steel singing plow also increased agricultural productivity. Improvements in wheat harvesting such as Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper also multiplied farmers' productivity. As a result, corn and wheat harvests doubled between 1840 and 1860. By 1850, trains steamed along 9,000 miles of track, almost two-thirds of it in New England and the Middle Atlantic states. By 1860, the railroads helped the United States to become the world's second greatest industrial power. In addition to speeding transportation, the railroads propelled the growth of the iron and coal industries, both vital to railroad construction and operation. The growing railroad industry also stimulated the telegraph industry. By 1861, more than 50,000 miles of wire stretched alongside railroad tracks. Almost all railroads were built and owned by private corporations rather than by the government. These private investments were massive. The railroad boom of the 1850s signaled the growing industrial might of the American economy, and in the 1840s and 1850s linked an expanding westward moving population by animals and farms, as well as by machines, steam, railroads, and cities. More than anything, however, the idea of manifest destiny drove hundreds of settlers west. Most Americans believe that the superiority of their institutions and white culture bestowed on them a God-given right to spread their civilization across the continent. In 1845, New York journalist John L. O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny as the latest justification for white settlers to take the land they coveted. Sullivan claimed that it was the nation's manifest destiny to transport its values and civilization westward. Manifest destiny framed the American conquest of the West as part of a divine plan. According to Manifest Destiny, the United States would and should inevitably expand westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The word manifest means obvious, and its use here implied that there was no question such expansion should occur. The word destiny indicated that many Americans believe westward expansion was inevitable and a right. Those of a more religious character saw this destiny as ordained by God. However, the less pious also believe in manifest destiny, seeing it as a sign of the greatness of the American people. Thus, the idea was to spread democracy and European lifestyle in the West. The idea also included taming the Western landscape. When it pertained to the people that were already living in the West, the idea was to exterminate or convert Native Americans. They were often seen as an obstacle to the manifest destiny goal. When it pertained to the Mexican population living in the West, the idea was to obtain the land from the new Mexican government by one way or another. John L. Sullivan's document reads in part, "Invisible and distracted Mexico never can exert any real governmental authority over such a country. The Anglo-Saxon foot is already on its borders. Already the advance guard of the irresistible army of Anglo-Saxon immigration has begun to pour down upon it, armed with the plow and rifle. A population will soon be in actual occupation of California, over which it will be idle for Mexico to dream of dominion." As important as national pride and racial arrogance were to manifest destiny, economic gain made up its core. American expansionists first looked towards the vast Oregon country of the West. Both Britain and the United States laid claim to Oregon in 1818. The two countries settled on a joint occupation that would leave Oregon free and open to settlement by both countries. By the late 1830s, settlers began to trickle along the Oregon Trail. As they moved westward, immigrants encountered plain Indians, some of who were peaceful, sedentary farmers. However, the majority of the tribes from the central and southern plains were horse-mounted, nomadic, non-agricultural peoples whose warriors symbolized the whites' idea of the savage Indian. And although the federal government had implemented a policy of forced removal since the Andrew Jackson administration, initially some Indian groups in the Great Plains remained too powerful to remove. Plain Indians struck fear in the hearts of the settlers on the wagon trains, and the immigrants insisted that the federal government provide them with more protection. In reality, the Native Americans had far more to fear from the migrants. So in 1851, the government adopted a new policy of Indian concentration and persuaded the Plain Indians to sign agreements to clear a wide corridor for wagon trains by restricting Native Americans to specific areas that whites promised they will never violate. Unfortunately, as we have seen in the past, those treaties will not be fulfilled by the Americans. Ironically, disease and accidents caused many more deaths along the trail than did Indian attacks, which migrants feared the most. The Oregon Trail was hard, and many settlers will have to endure a harsh environment and start from scratch in an unknown land. But despite the ordeal of the trail and the difficulties of starting from scratch, immigrants continued to move westward. At the end of the day, the manifest destiny aspiration of creating a democratic utopia in the West rested on those who picked up their possessions and their families and moved west. Western settlers usually migrated as families and settled along rivers. Settlements often coalesced around local traditions, especially religion, carried from Eastern settlements. These shared understandings encouraged a strong sense of cooperation among Western settlers that forged communities on the frontier. The experience was described differently by men and women. When men reached Oregon, they saw opportunity. When women reached Oregon, they found a wilderness whose primitive state led to unending work. On the other hand, there often existed an openness of frontier society that resulted in modestly more opportunities for women. Husband needed partners in setting up a homestead and working in the field to provide food for the family. Suitable wives were often in short supply, enabling some to informally negotiate more power in their households. While some were moving west for economic opportunity, others were moving west for other reasons. In 1830, Joseph Smith Jr. published the Book of Mormon and founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. Smith dispatched early converts as missionaries to take the message of the Book of Mormon throughout the United States, across the ocean to England and Ireland, and eventually even farther abroad. Continued growth and near constant opposition from both Protestant ministers and neighbors suspicious of their potential political power forced the Mormons to move several times, first from New York to Ohio, then to Missouri, and finally to Illinois, where they established a thriving community on the banks of the Mississippi River. In Nauvoo, as they called their city, Smith moved even further beyond the bounds of the Christian orthodoxy by continuing to pronounce additional revelations and introducing secret rites to be performed in Mormon temples. More controversially, Smith and a selected group of his most loyal followers began taking additional wives. Smith himself married at least 30 women. After Smith sanctioned plural marriage, polygamy, non-Mormons arrested Smith and his brother. On June 27, 1844, a mob stormed the jail in which Smith and his brother were being held and shot both men dead. The embattled church turned to Brigham Young as its new leader. He immediately began to plan an exodus of his people from Illinois to their new home beside the Great Salt Lake. In 1850, the Mormon Kingdom became annexed to the United States as a Utah territory. Outraged at the Mormon practice of polygamy, the United States sent an army of 2,500 troops to invade Salt Lake City in what was known as the Mormon War. The Mormon War demonstrated that the idea of manifest destiny did not only threaten Native Americans and Mexicans, but anyone who did not fit into the idea of Anglo-Saxon cultural norm. People like the Mormons were seen at the time as a threat to American morality and institutions. That is all for now. You will continue to learn what happens as more and more Americans continue to move west on the next lecture.